So Quentin, a little bit of biographical information before he kicks us off. Quentin is a Longhorn alumni, a McCombs graduate from 2018. Prior to coming to business school at UT, Quentin spent a decade in politics. So you can imagine he was really ready to make a pivot coming into the business world. While he was here at Texas, him and his co-founder realized that there was an opportunity to provide healthier food to students on campus, and they started Ranch Hand, an incredibly delicious salad and protein-based food truck that led to insights in the alcoholic beverage market here in Austin that grew into Ranch Riders Spirits, which Quentin now cooperates with his co-founder. And so we're delighted to have Quentin moderate our panel today. Quentin, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Appreciate it. Thrilled to be here. First, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Arif Fazal. Arif is the founder and managing director of Blueberry Ventures, which is a CPG-focused VC firm. They've done deals with a lot of notable brands in the space, including Rhythm Superfoods, Austin Eastsiders, and Hybrew. Next up, we have Clayton Christopher, seasoned Austin entrepreneur and investor, founded Sweetleaf Tea, Deep Eddy Vodka, Waterloo, Kavu Ventures, and many, many more. And then we have Dave Rule, who's the VP of Marketing at Austin Eastsiders, who also comes to us from Kind Snacks and Vermont Smoke and Cure. I know we have a limited time, so I wanted to go ahead and jump right in. First off, obviously no one could have foreseen what was to come in February 2020, right? Especially no matter what category you were in. But wanted to talk to specifically what was happening at Eastsiders kind of before, during, and after COVID kind of became an inescapable reality. Maybe Dave, you can kind of tell us what was in the works for South by ACL, and Clayton and Arif, you can kind of tell us from a 10,000 foot perspective on the business or expansion or distribution, what was in the works, and then kind of how all those things got sidelined or repurposed kind of in late March or April.
Sounds good. Is Dave with us, or did we lose him?
All right, sorry guys, I was on mute. Classic Zoom mistake. So yeah, going into the year, it's super exciting because not only do we have South by Southwest, which is always a huge activation for us with our new products, we're actually launching a whole new line extension. Back when I started the company, it started with the company in 2016. I think we had 3 flavors. And we really ramped up our new product development. Going into the year, we had 3 new flavors and a full line extension with Austin Eastsiders seltzers. So that was really big news. And in addition to that, we had already begun development on a restaurant, which ended up being one of the the toughest gigs in town with COVID, right? So we were launching a brand new line extension innovations into a pandemic, and we were also launching a restaurant into a pandemic. So that was kind of what was going on before, and then there was just a lot of reaction to it. I think it was right around March 12th or March 11th, 16th. That's when everybody started battening down the hatches, and where we started making all of our pivots. But yeah, it's been a wild ride. That's what we were doing before COVID. I mean, do you want to get right into what we did once it hit?
Sure. Yeah, I think it'd be fascinating for everyone to hear kind of once it hit and became an inescapable reality. Like what was the team talking about? How what was the immediate plan B? I think everyone was kind of panicking and didn't really know what came next. So I think a brief synopsis of what the conversations were like then would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think the highlights are that all our marketing strategy, go to market, a lot of it has to do with retail. A lot of it has to do with driving trial. You drive trial through retail activities, events, and on premise. And all 3 of those things became hugely impacted, right? To drive trial with new products. Also, just 35% of our business goes to the on premise. So with that going away, that really, I think every industry that was impacted by COVID, the biggest thing was to preserve cash, control expenses, make it to the other side of the river. Survive for the win was sort of the rallying call. And that's what we did. And so, we didn't shut down shop. What we did is we made a lot of smart changes to our strategy. Just as far as, cutting our expenses. We shut down our tap room, our first tap room that was running, 50 part-time folks that were out there doing demos for us at retail. There's no longer, they didn't have a job for them. We did actually put 8 teammates on furlough. So we really battened down the hatches, but with the remaining funds that we had, we got really smart. And with our teammates, everybody, we had a lot of sort of like rally meetings, and it was a lot about just take your job description and take that business plan that we put together and worked so hard for the last 8 months and just roll it up in a ball and throw it in the trash, because we're going to have to start from scratch here and play the hand that we're dealt. So there was a lot of creativity, I think, from, how do we drive trial and awareness around our products? How do we continue to develop this major investment, which was a restaurant? And then how do we go to market with those things, all during a very, fluid situation, especially that first month. It just seemed like every week it got exponentially worse. And you're just like, when is that, when is that rate of decline going to stop? It just felt like the sky was falling for a while, but our team kept it together. And I think since day one, a great thing about Austin Eastsiders has been our team's resiliency and the ability to adapt. So I think those are a lot of the things. We could get deep on any of those.
Love that. Clayton, I know you come from Deep Eddy, and so obviously there's background experience, but there's no institutional precedent, right, from a business experience, at least for any of us, for something like COVID. So curious how you were approaching it, if there was anything that you could lean on, from, at least in the alcohol perspective, from Deep Eddy experience, or was it completely unprecedented?
I mean, I think for all CPG businesses, most early stage brands did not benefit from COVID. While there was a big surge in sales in grocery stores, it was with established brands. People aren't looking towards innovation and trying new products and spending the same amount of time reading labels and that they were before. So, it didn't necessarily help a lot of the smaller brands out there. A lot of the advice that I was giving to CEOs and Dave and his team did a great job of this, but you got peacetime CEOs, you're in growth mode, you're thinking creatively, innovation. You've got wartime CEOs, and it's really tough to pivot from a peacetime CEO to a wartime CEO, because it's a very different skill set. It's a very different mentality. But Dave and team at Austin Eastsiders, I'd say we quickly battened down the hatches. There's just so many unknowns when COVID first hit. As Dave said, we have about 37% of our revenue was coming from on-premise. On-premise was gone, zero, shut down. And, thank God it was only 35 or so percent. Because there's a lot of smaller craft beer companies out there that on-premise is like 80%, 90% of their revenue. And it's typically the smaller the craft beer player, the larger percentage of their revenue is on-premise or from their tap room. So luckily we weren't as exposed to it. And, we were able to play defense so that we can now get back into playing offense, which is a lot more fun.
Awesome. And Arif, I know that Blueberry does a lot of other CPG non-alcohol brands, and I'm curious kind of what the compare contrast is with Austin Eastsiders being a booze brand. I think that, overall as a category, booze has kind of seen a positive uptick in consumption. Obviously, since COVID, people have been at home, people have been bored. So curious how Eastsiders has fared in contrast with some of the other brands that you've seen out there in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we have a couple other alcohol investments as well. So I could talk to, vis-a-vis other alcohol, but just more broadly, Clayton nailed it when he said sort of broadly throughout CPG, the smaller folks have been harder hit, at least out of the gate. with COVID as consumers sort of flocked to what I call familiarity. And, David's done an amazing job at Eastsiders sort of taking this traditional, concept of liquid to lips in store on premise as a mechanism to get consumers into a brand for Eastsiders, and sort of translating that into how do you do that digitally, right? And Dave's team has done it incredibly well. And so, across CPG, everyone was asking that question, right? We can't sample at, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you then impart those same concepts and that same feeling to a consumer in a very, very different way? So, as this industry is very creative and very resilient, a lot has come to bear as a result of, the necessity to shift. And, Clayton touched upon this concept of moving from defense to offense. And, I think what we've seen sort of throughout the industry is, once that, everybody had kind of shored the ship, if you will, and batten down the hatches, how do you then figure out what's the right course to navigate such that you can come out and find the sun and find the wind quicker, faster, and be stronger when you come out of things? Quinn, you're on mute.
That was great to kick off. So talking about kind of what the actual strategy for adapting was, I'm curious, a lot of alcohol brands saw COVID as an opportunity to really strengthen other channels that aren't necessarily often associated with alcohol. So I'm obviously referring to channels like D2C, which is a little bit tricky given the fact that every category is dominated by a different regulatory framework, right? But curious kind of for, if the on-premise shut down, where did you redirect your sales channels to? Was there a newfound focus on channels like Drizzly and delivery, or potentially even direct to consumer? I know obviously that being a little bit tricky with the shutdown in on-premise, like you said, Clayton and Dave. Curious, obviously for you guys that probably meant way less kegs and much more cans, things like that. Dave, I'll let you go ahead and kick it off.
Yeah, so you've got it right. Everything moved to off premise, and everybody started picking up or getting their groceries delivered, except for the brave souls that wanted to go shopping. And and actually retail merchandising and that whole game really changed a lot too. But to answer your question, we pivoted a lot of we're always prioritizing our resources, right? What's our greatest potential return on investment? And so for us, it's always been retail demo program. It's always focused around potential intent to purchase, proximity to purchase, to focus our funds. When this happened, we sort of gained some bandwidth from some teammates who used to be doing that work. Talk about take your job description and throw it away, and try to figure out what the best path forward is. And some of the things that we did, I guess just from a top line perspective, we funneled more of as a percentage of our budget shrank greatly. That's the best way to pivot your finances, is to take away marketing dollars and be flexible with that. And when we did that, the new shape of our budget, we moved, originally 17% of our marketing spend was focused on digital. And that through that transition, it became 40% of our budget. And the way, so that we also, so not only just our funds, but also our sweat sort of happened in digital. I can kind of like walk through that. The first is, as far as like digital ad spend, focusing on social media advertising and targeting, all sort of within, geographies and proximity to purchase. We also have a pretty sophisticated search engine marketing program, Google AdWords. We serve ads to people who are showing intent to purchase through their search. So we put a little bit more funds there. It's a pretty efficient impression device to sort of target consumers that are looking for ciders or looking for ciders from Texas and other sort of like great search terms like that. But what we also did was we attacked this monster we never had the bandwidth for, which is partner e-commerce merchandising. And so that's, there's 22 focus retailers selling online that we wanted to make sure that and it's kind of a wily beast. Anyone who's been on, Amazon platforms, partner e-commerce platforms, that your copy and your photography and your videos and your storytelling on your product pages is all super important to conversions. And so we actually spent a lot of time working with all of those vendors to update those assets and make sure that it actually took a lot of time to work with 22 vendors to make sure that we were merchandised correctly online. That was a big focus for us. We also did talk to the folks like Drizzly, because of the 3-tier system. You can't, it's interesting from a return on investment perspective. There's a lot of people that say they would stay away from Drizzly, but Drizzly just had a giant boom. So that kind of changed, right, through COVID, because people are getting deliveries. And the way we attacked Drizzly was to make sure that we were being distributed through all of the stores that service Drizzly. So running gap reports, as distribution gap reports, and making sure that, when you go on Drizzly and you start making your purchase, the products that are served to you are the ones that are available at the store that services your location, right? So if you're not in the store, you're not on Drizzly to that specific consumer. So distribution gaps for Drizzly. But then we did also launch our own direct to consumer. You can actually buy e-ciders through our website now and have it shipped to your home, which was, again, something we never prioritized because of the size of the prize, but it gave us this great opportunity to get that off the ground. And I think the first weekend we did $3,000 in e-cider sales. So it was like maybe even more than we thought.
David, maybe for the viewers, with the 3-tier laws, how are we able to do that?
So, so the biggest thing is if the retailer owns that sales channel, if it's not an in-between. So like Drizzly, you could actually buy advertising with Drizzly. It just might not be very efficient. You could buy, so you can do it with Drizzly because Drizzly is not the retailer. You can't give the retailer money for preferential display on those channels.
Right, but for these liquor brands to be able to ship direct to consumer, like with us, Frost and E-Ciders, when they go on our website to buy Austin E-Ciders, kind of legally, how are we able to navigate that?
So we're regulated as a wine. And so wine has been shipping to consumers. So each,
Gotcha.
it's actually, I couldn't tell you the nuance from category to category, state by state, because it does change. And if you just try to use logic, of course, that doesn't work because it's these crazy loopholes and legal standards. So the way that we did it as a wine, and then also there's just these huge hoops. Each state you have to sort of be compliant in each state, and so it's a mountain of paperwork and fees if you wanted to open up all of those states on your own. So I think for a wine based, we worked with a partner called Vino Shipper, and they work as our conduit to do all those legal hurdles. And in one swoop, we give them a percentage, we give them points, of course, to use their platform, but they make us compliant in 39 states. So in one swoop, we were able to open up direct to consumer shipments to 39 states through the Vino Shipper platform.
That's fascinating. So it's fascinating to think about how, pre-COVID, what distribution gap meant was, a salesperson being on the ground, going to check inventory at the store. What merchandising meant was going to the shelf and making sure that every Awesome E-Cider can, the logo is facing outward towards the customer. Whereas now you're trying to do that in a completely digital space. Curious to hear from you, Clayton or Reef. Do you think that, maybe once there's a vaccine and on-premise starts to allow a much greater capacity, it's upwards of 75 to 80%, maybe sometime mid to late next year. Do you see these channels like drilling direct to consumer? Do you expect them to maintain a share? In other words, do you expect consumers to? Do you think that consumer habits have permanently changed to expect this on-demand delivery D2C channel for alcohol, or do you think that they'll kind of resume normalcy and again go back to the store and go to on-premise? Or if you can kick it off.
Yeah, I'll take that, Clayton, first, and then you can chime in. But I think the short answer to your question, Quentin, is absolutely, right? So the consumer is going to want to consume the way that they want to consume. And if anything, what COVID has done, and this is across CPG, not just specific to alcohol, but it's given the consumer yet another opportunity to procure and acquire, and done so in a way where obviously there's been a huge spike in e-commerce, and whether that's D2C or Amazon or other e-commerce channels, the consumer expects to be able to get that way. And then specifically within alcohol, obviously with the Drizzlies and the Bevmos and delivering, and it is now, alcohol is now at a place where the rest of consumer was, in terms of, I want it now, I can get it in a few hours type of thing. So, Quentin, I definitely see a place for these types of, newer models. And I sort of say new tongue in cheek because they're not that new, right? But they've just been accelerated in the last 6 months. With that said, I mean, you mentioned sort of when things come back, right? It's going to be really interesting, right? We've already seen in alcohol, we've seen sort of a, deceleration of craft breweries and a lot of that, a lot of stress there. There's going to be more stress. Even the Texas Craft Brewer Alliance just came out and said 60% of Texas craft brewers will be gone in a year. And so, I think what's going to happen is that there's going to be, and just generally sort of on premise, there's data out there that suggests 30 to 40% of restaurants won't come back, right? So, the folks that are going to come back will probably come back very strong, because I do think there's going to be, on the flip side of all that, there's this pent up consumer demand. I mean, we already saw a little bit in the summer, and this is, of course, is state specific based upon, reopening mandates in different states are different. But, there's this pent up demand. People are social, right? And alcohol sort of helps in to bring people together in that social environment. So, it's I think the folks that do come out of this, the tasting rooms, the on-premise restaurants, bars, etc. It's just going to matter. It's going to be a matter of, when can they get capacities up? Because I think that right now consumers are still pretty reluctant, right? We've seen a tapering off, frankly, in the last 3 months in terms of consumers' willingness to get out there. They started getting out there in June and July, but that'll come back, to your point, when there's a little bit more of a halo of safety as it relates to COVID with respect to a vaccine.
Yeah, and to build on that, there's a lot of experts in our industry that feels like on-premise bars and restaurants will never be back to where it was. Who knows if that's the case? I wouldn't want to bet my business that we're going to be back to where we were a year from now. What I can tell you is that it takes, humans, it takes us a long time to acquire a habit, and it takes us just as long to break a habit. And we're in the midst of new habits being formed. As the vaccine comes out next year, the folks on this Zoom call will not be the ones getting the vaccine in the first half of the year. It's going to be the first response workers. It's going to be elderly, people that are most sick. So, expect for the kind of the new normal to continue well through next year and into 2022. So I think that's really, from an advice perspective and from a business perspective, the way that we look at it is we've got to adapt to a new norm. There's been a massive shift to online. That's across CPG, but with alcohol as well. And that's not going away. There's new ways of purchasing products and new habits, new patterns that have emerged, and people have gotten used to it, and that's going to continue. So, you've got to adapt to that, or you're going to get left behind. And so, that's the advice that I'm trying to give folks is these new habits, whether it's working virtually, or whether it's the huge surge in e-com, they're here to stay.
Awesome. And then, at the risk of boring a lot of our viewers, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question, given the fact that I co-founded a canned cocktail company, and Awesome E-Ciders is down cans. And I think you guys know what I'm about to ask. But one of the things that COVID did was it accelerated this can shortage that was already looming for a lot of beverage producers that were in cans, right? Already you were seeing a lot of consumers gravitate towards consuming things in cans. People that were in bottles were gravitating towards using cans as the vessel. Right before COVID hit, I think the only corporation that correctly predicted the can shortage was AB, and so they immediately bought a ton of cans that were slated to be produced for the rest of the year, thereby accelerating the can shortage for everyone else. Curious to hear if E-Ciders has experienced any problems due to the can shortage. If any of our viewers just simply Google can shortage, it's become a massive problem for every beverage company in the space.
It's been I can answer real quick, and the quick answer is it has not impacted us. It's only impacted our practices. We work with a broker between us and the can manufacturers. So sometimes we get things made by Crown, sometimes by Ball, and we use a broker in between. And I think the purchasing power that they have and the leverage that we have with them, being a partner with them for a long time, gives us some insulation to this point. What we're doing is we're providing forecasts ahead of time. We're providing artwork much earlier than we used to, and we're just being careful on our orders and ordering up and trying to stay fat without being irresponsible with our cash. So thus far, we have not had any concerns.
Yeah, I think it's really
we're keeping our eye on the ball.
Yeah, I think it's really, Quentin, it's been more challenging for the smaller brands, for the really early stage brands, because any of these suppliers know that they're taking a risk and they're largely taking a bet when they start to do business with a lot of these early stage brands, which is why most of them pay upfront COD versus getting 15 or 30-day credit terms. So for the more established brands like Austin East Ciders, even though we're not a big brand, we've just been around for a while, we tend to have better, more long-standing relationships, with these suppliers, where it's really, my heart goes out to these earlier stage brands like, Ranch Rider. It sounds like you've been scrappy and been able to secure the inventory that you need, but it's not the case with a lot of them, because these suppliers see those brands as the biggest risk, and they're playing defense during these times as well. How's it been for you, Quentin? Have you been able to get the cans that you need for Ranch Rider?
We have. We've been a lot more fortunate than a lot of other startup brands in the space who we've heard directly from them that they have to sit on production because there's a lack of cans, right? But we've employed almost dozens of people to literally scour the ends of the earth because Ball and Crown have been allocated, not only through the rest of this year, but also next year. So it's been an adventure, but we're going to a degree that I think is attracting a little bit more attention from the brokers and the main companies. But we've been able to procure what we needed thus far.
Well, if you get short and you have some Ranch Rider, the stickers, you can come over to Austin East Ciders. We'll give you some cans, and you put your sticker right on the front of it.
This is recording, Clayton, so I might have to take that. Awesome. And kind of getting to a little bit more broad topics, curious to hear from you, Clayton, and you, Arif, about there's been a lot of literature. Obviously, we've been talking about how startups are, emerging brands or beginning brands, young brands are having a little bit more trouble capturing the attention of consumers during COVID, because people that are in the grocery store want to get in and get out. But curious to hear from you on a venture capital perspective. Have you been signing many deals given COVID? Would you be signing more or less, in a non-COVID environment? Is this kind of what you expected from a deal signing or investment environment for this year, or kind of how has that changed throughout the year? Clayton, you can go ahead and kick it off.
Sure. I think everybody kind of right when COVID hit in March, most investors, I saw a decrease in deals getting closed. I think a lot of folks kind of put pencils down for a bit, just not knowing, what was in front of us. I think that we've adjusted to that. We're certainly seeing plenty of deals getting done. Early on, I thought valuations were going to come down quite a bit, but they seem to have returned, the trickle down from the stock market that everyone's scratching their head about that continues to stay at record levels. Never bet against the Fed. Money's really cheap right now in terms of debt. So I think that's fueling a lot of transactions, a lot of deals. So no, it's a robust market right now. There is a lot of brands raising capital and getting deals done and getting them done at good valuations. So I think that's all super positive for our industry. Arif, what were you seeing?
Yeah, no, I mean, Clayton nailed it. Just a lot of the same. Maybe Quentin, I'll address the first part of your question in terms of you alluded to smaller companies coming out of the gates. One of the things that we've seen is that, it's interesting, right? The smaller the company, the less dependent the company was presumably on the disruption, the dislocation that came in early March as it related to any sort of on-premise consumption on the one hand, and then retail on the other hand. So, a handful of companies that we've been getting close to and the like, came into this year saying they were going to go, the first 1,000 doors, if you will, and sort of prove a bit and see what velocities look like. And that just wasn't there, right, come March. And whether they had been authorized and what their resets weren't happening, or whether they had frankly been already put in line, they weren't able to effectuate much at the store level for obvious reasons. But what they were able to do is, because they were small, they were able to be small, which is do one of the tenets of being small, which was to pivot, right? And so immediately sort of focusing attention to where they could focus attention. And we've seen a number of stellar results that associated with that type of pivot. And so a lot of smaller guys, being scrappy, women and men entrepreneurs out there that are leading their businesses to say, hey, we're gonna focus things exclusively online and get the most that we can get out of, whether it be direct to consumer, through building their own Shopify websites and really hammering social media, or Amazon. And there's been some pretty amazing stories for those who've done that, because customer acquisition costs we're in Q2 at an all-time low. Consumers were obviously at home, and they had a little extra time on their devices. So, it was sort of this perfect storm, if you will, to not only accelerate D2C and e-com, which we spoke about earlier, but also for brands to be able to find another outlet which could also drive, meaningful commerce. So that was a pretty exciting silver lining for a lot of earlier stage companies. The story's a little different, the later stage companies, which we can get into if you like, but just wanted to kind of share that, given that I think most of the audience is probably on the startup-y end of things.
Yeah, exactly. And Arif, to your point, just a follow-up question. So obviously the venture capital environment, the investing environment, that's been covered. The early brands environment, that's been covered. Just to touch on the actual startup founder, Clayton mentioned the wartime CEO. I think that there's also a lot of founders out there that are wartime founders, right? There was an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day about how the number of LLC filings and applications is actually higher this year than it was last year. And it's because a lot of people are looking at this environment, thinking about new ideas and beginning to execute them and put them into practice. And so they're going to starting their own businesses. But I'm curious, what's your 10,000 foot take on what it looks like to create a startup in this kind of environment? Has anything crossed your desk that's obviously super early stage that you find intriguing, that obviously would not have come to pass if it were not for entrepreneurs getting creative, thinking about COVID?
Yeah, I think downturns, if we are truly in a downturn, by some regards we're in a recession, but if you look at the stock market, we're not. But downturns tend to catalyze, and they tend to bring out, like you said, sort of wartime founders, right? Sort of the scrappiest of the scrappiest. And, lots of great brands and businesses will be built in this time. Taking the disruption and thinking in an orthogonal way of how things have been done before. I think there's tons of different opportunities there. And yes, I mean, from a deal flow, Quentin, you alluded to, yeah, we're sort of, things haven't really slowed down, maybe a tick. But frankly, a tick isn't much, and who knows if that's as a result of COVID. And Clayton mentioned this earlier, but it's crazy to me in a lot of regards to see how many deals are still getting done and the valuations that they're getting done around. It's, there's a lot of capital. And to what you said, Quentin, there's a ton of great entrepreneurs out there And we've got so much green field in food, beverage, and nutrition. And then within that, specifically alcohol. I mean, we've made 3 alcohol investments, have a huge forward look on kind of the evolution in the next generation of alcohol. So long answer to your short question, yeah, I think it's going to be it's a bumper time to go out and those that can navigate the challenges that exist now will come out ahead and come out ahead stronger.
I completely agree. And to build on Arif's point a bit, I would say something that I've seen dramatically change broadly, but certainly for me personally in investing is that was different pre-COVID to a certain degree. But it's like, I wouldn't even think about investing in a brand now if they didn't have a strong e-com strategy. And the companies that I've been looking hardest at, talking most to on potential investments are digitally native. Literally outside the spirit space, obviously spirit is a little unique, but within traditional CPG, most of these, we're just seeing more and more brands that have started online, have grown their companies profitably. That used to not be the MO. It used to be like, okay, quality of revenue, but we're fine with them losing money as long as they're building strong quality top line growth. And that's just not the case anymore. Profitability is a lot more important. And while it may not happen right out of the gate, it's easier you're going to have much higher margins and the ability to be profitable if you've built a good online business first. So I'd say that's a new criteria that's kind of entered the marketplace that I think is pretty ubiquitous, for any VC out there looking at brands.
Absolutely. The need to go digital, or at least have a digital presence, has become imperative. Whereas before, I guess it was maybe a little bit more optional. I'm going to start fielding questions from the audience now, people that are genuinely interested in hearing from the panelists. We've got one for you, Dave. Obviously getting to how marketing strategies have changed. Now less people are obviously going out to bars, even though they're opening up. There's a lot of people that, the next time they go to a bar, they have no idea when that's going to be. So the question is, how can you use marketing strategies to tap into home consumption by, a couple of people that live together, or by small groups of people who get together in their backyard? How do you market to those people when, they're not, like you said, there is no liquid to lips, there's no on-premise presence, they want to stay away from on-premise, if they even want to go into off-premise, right? Like, what is the challenging part about marketing to those people, and what does that strategy look like for Eastsiders?
Well, retail is still super important, right? I think a lot of the things that we did to change are the quality of our merchandising on partner e-commerce websites. So when I say partner e-commerce, I'm saying like HEB Direct, HEB Curbside, Kroger, places like that, making sure that we look good there. Also making sure that we still look good in stores. There's a lot of people still going into stores and shopping. The grocery workers are actually pretty stressed during this time. There's a limitation to how many vendors can come in and help them with things like merchandising. They used to actually augment their human resources as far as like pulling stocks forward. So safely, if you can get in there and be impactful at retail and help those buyers and those category managers, you might be able to get more display activity, and displays definitely drive trial. Of course, we have a restaurant now, and we are operating a restaurant, and it's going well, considering that we're opening during COVID. We're actually happy with how things are progressing, and of course we're trying to get better all the time, but that's a huge trial driver for us. It's a great piece of media on a highly trafficked road. So it actually makes a pretty big splash and an impression there. So I think that's really big. And then our field marketing folks, we have a very small team that's pretty savvy, are actually very savvy, and they are finding opportunities to scale trial activity. So we did some interesting things right in the beginning. We were doing complimentary 6-packs to unemployed service workers, which actually drove a lot of people for to-go business at our tap room. So caring platform work. We have donated a lot of product to first responders and frontline folks through organizations. We worked with a social influencer, Taste of Cocoa, to do complimentary lunches and Eastsiders. for unemployed service industry folks as well. And of course, those guys eventually are going to go back, and so you're helping people who really deserve it, and it goes right back to our values. Those people are actually also going to be recommending beverages to people when on-premise opens back up, right? So it's sort of a great virtuous circle. But of course, social advertising, smart targeting, good content, all those things. It's just, of course, the number one behavior we want to drive is a purchase, right? The second best behavior we can drive is trial and taste. And of course, that's great to do in a one-to-one experience. But you can pique curiosity and you can kind of drive people down the funnel through some smart digital advertising as well. On the event front, there's also interesting things that are emerging, like I believe in Cedar Park, there's going to be with some local musicians, Wild Child and some other folks, where it's a drive-in concert. So we're starting to see event innovation and how we execute and have social distancing and being safe while also having experiential events. There's another place that was doing sort of pre-fee picnic dinners, so things, our big focus now is trying to find those activities that are scalable. Another great one I'll give you, Quentin, is donating product to food trucks. They can give that to consumers, right? And a lot of people are buying food from food trucks right now.
Love that.
So there's ways.
I endorse that.
Yeah. We used to give a lot of product to La Barbecue, kegs and cases, and people come up and buy their barbecue and have an East Sider. And when they finally moved into the Quickie Picky, after years of doing that, the next week, 70% of all alcohol sales at the Quickie Picky was East Siders. So you see that behavior, you drive that behavior. That's just a good little anecdotal case study on, driving that behavior.
Absolutely.
I dovetail onto that. It's Dave is and his team have really been that entrepreneurial scrappiness that we've been talking about as it relates to, okay, what can we do now and how can we drive things? And, just taking a step back for a second, there's so much of the alcohol world in terms of how it's regulated is predicated on, age-old, et cetera, right? So, some of that was broken down through COVID, and frankly, to allow commerce to continue, right? To allow consumers to continue. It'll be interesting to see how the disruption in the ability of the consumer, for example, just being able to take something to go. Right? How simple of a concept is that, right? That's just completely been now tossed on us. In other places, as I understand, not being in Austin. But, I think there's going to be a lot of that from a behavioral, structural that will change and will evolve as it should, frankly.
Awesome. Love it. I'm glad you spoke about regulations, Arif, because I think we've got a lot of questions from the audience about regulatory changes. I know that the TABC has been kind of, regularly updating their guidance, not only towards on-premise establishments, but, distilleries, tasting rooms. Clayton, I know that Deep Eddy has been affected. Curious if you can kind of speak about how, maybe one or two of those regulatory changes have affected Eastsiders. Dave, I know you were talking about to-go earlier, and I know that there was some unclear guidance really early on what constituted to-go, how much could be to-go. But I think that while the three-tier system is here to stay, I think that that's pretty, you can make an undoubted statement such as that. I think that there's definitely room now, to kind of preserve these little holes that, different channels that you can go through. But I'm curious to hear how, maybe one or two experiences from you, Dave, about either the restaurant or to-go or direct-to-consumer, kind of what it was like when it happened, and was it unclear? What was the experience?
Well, we actually drove pretty decent to-go sales. Wasn't necessarily our intent with the program, but when we did do the 6-pack program to unemployed service industry folks, that was actually pretty high demand, and people were making additional purchases while they were getting their 6-pack. honestly, I think from a taproom perspective, that to-go business, if you're just to go, it's just cute. You know, it's really not, it's not super scalable. We're trying to make those cart sizes bigger, like incentivize case purchases and things like that. But really, the tap rooms, you really want to have the dine-in or the drink-in experience to really drive your revenue there. So it's good to do, and everything counts. So you do it. But that was our experience, is that the to-go hasn't been, you know, it's no replacement to having dine-in and drink-in. With Barton Springs, it's a huge part of it because it's a restaurant. We make pizza, so pizza is a fantastic thing to sell to go. So that really isn't a change. It's something we anticipated. But I think the rules that changed that are kind of interesting and maybe didn't impact us as much is the ability for some of these restaurants now can sell all of their alcohol to go. They can give you bottles of wine for your food that you're taking home with you. And they can actually mix cocktails and put it in a sealed container and give you a Negroni, which they weren't able to do before. So I think all that's been interesting. And we're still navigating it, but none of it has been you know, for like purely to go. It hasn't been a huge driver of sales. I mean, the on-premise gap, sure, we're selling some product now to on-premise that is then in return selling that product to go, but it's just no replacement.
Got it.
And one thing I'd also mention is, you know, for any early stage brand or product, brand launching new flavors, but especially for earlier stage brands, it is all about liquid to lips, or getting your product past people's lips. And David gave a great example of kind of scrappy ways to navigate the, you know, some of the regulatory hurdles that are out there. But, you know, I think the main point there is you've got to get creative. You have to figure out ways to get creative and get your brand and your product in the hands of your core consumer, you know, who you think your core consumer is, whether that's having to give some away to a barbecue truck so that they give it out for free. But, you know, listen, there's a lot of regulations within, with TABC and with liquor and alcohol. If you're not getting your hands slapped a little bit, you know, if you're not skiing a little bit on the edge, you're probably not doing a good job at being a scrappy, risk embracing entrepreneur. I mean, at Deep Eddy, we got our hands slapped a lot, and sometimes there was some fines associated with it. We just tried to really know the regulations so that we could kind of point to the regulations in the actual rule book, because we know them as well as a lot of the people enforcing them. And, you know, you just, the rules were created by the big guys to keep the little guys little. So you got to be willing to break the rules sometime. You just have to do it in a smart sort of way. But, you know, this whole COVID environment has certainly created a lot more challenges to get product past people's lips, because at the end of the day, it's got to be a great tasting product. Packaging can get them there once, you know, price may get them there once. We're never going to be a low cost provider, any of these brands on this call, but it's got to be great.
Clayton, I believe you went on mute at the end there.
Sorry about that, but yeah, y'all get you got to get the product past people's lips, and especially if you can do it in a way that helps create, you know, kind of a love affair. Like, I'd much rather people taste Austin East ciders for the first time when they're having some phenomenal barbecue than, you know, at some Walmart. Nothing against Walmart, we love them, but like, you know, passing out a little sample, you know, some 80-year-old lady in a hairnet, you know, in Walmart. Like, it's good. We're gonna be able to create a love affair much better when we sample to our core consumer in the right environment. So just, you know, I encourage everybody to put that thought into it.
Absolutely. We always say at Ranch Rider that the cheapest, most effective form of marketing is just free product, right? So kind of a little bit wrapping up, maybe second to last question. Arif, interested to hear from you, but now that the now on-premise has collapsed, and to Clayton's point earlier, there's no really telling when it's going to come back. There's a lot of other kind of momentum in CPG, especially within alcohol, right? All alcohol consumption has increased. Off-premise has obviously shot through the roof. Do you think that, is off-premise now the new playing field for brands? Is it going to become more saturated as like, now that everyone is going to cans and canned beverages are exploding and alcohol consumption is significantly increasing? Whereas before, on-premise, like consumers discovered brands on-premise before, right? That was kind of the conventional wisdom. Is now off-premise the name of the game, and to the indefinite future? Do you see it getting a lot more saturated in every category? Kind of, what do you see the landscape looking like now that COVID is here to stay for an indefinite amount of time?
Yeah, I think, look, what happened first with COVID is consumers were at home more and they drank more, right? So we saw alcohol sales rise, and they rose as a result of consumers flocking to what they know, right? The brands that are out there that are the bigger brands. So it wasn't, unfortunately, the smaller high growth brands that were where consumers spent on. Now, let's pull that forward, since we're 6 months into things now. If we call that the first 4, 8, maybe 12 weeks, subsequent to that, there's been more diversity, right? But there's still pretty strong top line increases for those legacy products that have historically been decreasing on a top line basis year over year. So with that said, right, what does off premise mean from the consumer's mind? It's unfortunately they're still not going into store and shopping, right? They're still going into store and checklist buying. And so as a result, it's just harder to discover. And if you're new, the objective is to get discovered. So, with a finite amount of space, in retail and in off premise, and an infinite amount of brands that are trying to get into that finite space, absolutely there's a squeeze. The other piece of this that I think will be unfortunately challenging for smaller companies is that, and there's two pieces. One, retailers as a result of COVID are rethinking their strategies, right? Are they air quote over skewed in certain categories, given some of the supply chain challenges they had? Do they want to reduce complexity? Does 70,000 SKUs in a grocery store make sense? Maybe it doesn't. And so, I don't think that's going to serve well the diverse landscape that the consumer desires and frankly, should have. But so there's that piece, and then the second piece is how is regionality going to play into things? And so I kind of see Quentin, yes, retail and off premise matters. It's always mattered, right? So I don't think that's changed. But from a discovery standpoint, I think where it's really the lever's going to be pulled is on a regional basis. I do think that even if the retailers are to skew down, they're still going to ensure that they're including regional players in categories where regional players make sense, and alcohol is certainly one of them.
Got it. Love it. A couple more questions from the audience before we come to a close. This one's a little bit of a softball, so I'm going to combine it with a little bit more of a hardball. Dave, I'll let you go ahead and answer it. One is, are you bringing the spice cider back? The other question that I would be interested in knowing is, how has the seltzer line been performing? Is it, what does that category look like? Because obviously cider is a beer alternative, right? And so spiked seltzer, and I feel like it's a spiked seltzer. Obviously, it's a growing category, but increasingly cutthroat. So would be curious to hear how the Austin Insiders experience has been competing on the seltzer realm.
Yeah, so spiced, yeah, we can bring anything back. It's had a couple years, and what's really cool with our new Barton Springs restaurant is that we have a 3-tank system there to do more sort of small batch and unique ciders there. And so you can see things come back, and you can see a lot of new things be produced out of there as well. So spiced, we love it. It's very reminiscent of the holidays and sort of like wintry, apple pie kind of experience. So we appreciate the support. Sounds like that came from a fan. On the seltzer front, again, I think it's interesting.
Hey, before you go there, an unabashed plug. If you like the spice, you should try the cranberry.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Again, you can make a Cape Cod cocktail with the cranberry.
Sorry, go ahead on seltzer.
It's actually the perfect pairing for your Thanksgiving dinner. So, but on the seltzer front, yeah, right. It's, we talked to buyers. We talked to the H-E-B buyer a couple of weeks ago, and he's just got seltzers coming out of his ears, right? So what he's looking for, and even the Whole Foods buyer who came in also kind of made a similar comment, is they're looking for somebody in that space with a hook, right? And in particular, how is it different? And what we see as being different with the seltzer is that it's made with real fruit. It's a real fruit expression for it. It's also made with a cider base versus like a cold brewed sugar or a malt base. So we do think we have something that's really got a hook, and right now it's the #3 craft seltzer in Texas. And it's interesting for us because we feel like we haven't had enough time in market. We think the potential is actually much greater than that. It going into COVID and shrinking, getting really small, which is like been the name of the game through COVID. It's really restricted sort of our education and our trial activities and all of that. So it is going well. And we think that there's a lot of room for growth. Where it's being sold,
launching in February wasn't ideal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But no, I'd say, I mean, Dave, you touched on it, but it's exceeded expectations. We're just getting out there, getting launched. But the biggest thing and the main reason that we launched the seltzer is we wanted to do something different. And as Dave said, all these other seltzers out there, they're made with fermented sugar water.
Mm-hmm.
We played around with fermented sugar water. It's really tough to make it taste good. And when you think about adding flavor or fruit juice to that, using really good apple juice from bittersweet apples, cider apples, which is what we use from northern France and from the UK, that are specifically designed for it. It is just such a cleaner base to work with. So our seltzer is really an extra dry cider that's only 100 calories. And so when we look at that as like a canvas to work with to bring these flavors to life, I mean, we started tasting ours against White Claw and some of the other ones. And yeah, I'm kind of plugging our product here, but it's the whole reason why we launched it. It has such a cleaner taste. I mean, yeah, cider is just a much cleaner base of alcohol than fermented sugar water. So
that's the feedback that we get from consumers. They say, "Oh, wow, it doesn't have to taste like those other ones." I'm converted. We haven't been able to maybe proactively convert as many people as we would like, through marketing.
Well, guys, jumping in here with the unfortunate task of closing out our session with you all. Really robust discussion. I feel that it's brunch time right now, right, in Austin, so it's appropriate to go ahead and pull out some East Ciders. Arif, maybe a little early for you on the West Coast, but I think I still have some of the champagne cider that came out. Specialty that I'd like to add request you bring back too, Dave?
Oh, Brut's out there. You can find Brut. It's 100 calorie, champagne expression of East Ciders. Yep. Yeah,
so I'll just put a little bit of orange juice in that right now and then continue on with my day. Thank you guys so much for being with us. I've gotten lots of votes in here for bringing the cider back. So Quentin, appreciate you teeing that up as a very critically important last point to make. learned so much with you. Every time I'm with you, we're so lucky to have you guys as part of this community and then working together on such a fantastic product. So thanks again for being part of Taste of Texas this year, you guys. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marissa.
Very kind. Thank you so much.
Bye, Quentin.